and give you $1 million. Uh-oh, looks like the recording just started, so good. But you can improve the value, and that improvement in value could be like, hey, I'm going to change the kitchen and I'm going to make this a more desirable house. I can change the number of bedrooms because there is an extra room that's no longer, or like a loft space that can enclose. There is a crappy backyard and I can improve that. So you can do a lot of things to real estate to improve the value. As far as I'm aware, there is zero you can do to improve the value of stocks. And then the last thing I think is really important is insider trading is allowed. As real estate agents, if you're not buying real estate and owning it, you're really giving up your biggest advantage because you have the ability to see things that other people don't see, and you see it before everyone else does, and it's completely legal for you to do that. So for instance, what Gary Keller says is one of the things you should ask yourself when you go on any listing appointment is, should I buy this house? That's the first question you should ask yourself. And if the answer is yes, then you work out a deal and you figure out how to make it happen. So those are just some of the whys. Anybody else have a why, or do they want to invest in real estate? Now, Troy, why do you invest in real estate besides those reasons up there?
Because I know it.
Because you know it? Yeah, that's a big deal. Yep, I know.
Warren Buffett, who's
Invest in what you know.
the most successful investor, invests in very few verticals because he wants to really understand what he's invested in, and you can't understand everything.
So be like Buffett and then
railroad companies. Who would think railroad companies? Well,
yeah. A lot of people don't really know this, but Warren Buffett doesn't really buy stock. He buys the company.
Right.
So he buys a big chunk of the company rather than buying like shares. So he doesn't invest like you or I might invest in the stock market.
That he can do some of those things that you and I never could with the amount of money
Improving value.
investing.
Yep.
Well, and he controls it.
Controls it. Yep.
Yeah, improves the value through control.
Yeah, by exerting control over it, he can do it.
Owns a high enough percentage of it.
Yep. Teresa, why do you invest in real estate?
To diversify my portfolio,
Okay, diversify your portfolio.
and I think it's fun.
It's
when I
fun.
do it.
Yeah, it's fun. I like it too. I mean, I've done a lot of things that I really enjoyed, you know, and it gives the opportunity. So I let my kids work on the real estate that I have. A lot of times I pay them to do that. And not only does it give them a chance to earn some money, but it gives them a chance to learn some things. And that kind of stuff. Just going back through a couple other things. So government wants you to own it. What I mean by tax advantages is there's phantom depreciation or depreciation, which is a phantom loss. So you guys, I'm sorry, what was your name again? Seth, that's right. Seth and Joe. And then of course I know you. So he's the Australian man, but the government, and in fact, even in Australia, I believe they have advantages for owning real estate too. I don't know if they're quite the same as here, but you can depreciate it. So any questions or anything other that you guys want to add? I know, Joe, you own real estate yet, or are you just still thinking? One Airbnb. So why did you get it? So Airbnb is another great area you can go into, but why did you buy that? Security. Yeah, that's another thing we didn't really mention is the real estate market has taken a fall before, but consistently, if you look at it, it was really only been 1 or 2 times that it went down in value. You look at the stock market, it's super volatile. And in real estate is generally considered a hedge. So like your Airbnb, you got some security because number one, you can insure it. So if it burns down, you get paid back. You can rent it out and make cash flow that way. If you get tired of it, you can sell it and make extra, you can capitalize on the appreciation you would have gotten and that kind of stuff. So, all right, we're going to try to flip the next slide. All right, so first thing I want to talk about now, this is for most people who haven't invested in real estate, or if you have, I want to go over just some of the terms because it's important to understand that when you're talking to an investor, a lot of times they're going to say things that you may not quite sound like you understand. And if you act like you don't understand it, they'll be able to tell pretty quick. So first thing, gross income. This is a pretty simple one. How much money does the property bring in on a gross basis annually? Typically annually. Sometimes you'll talk about monthly. Operating expenses, sometimes referred to as OpEx. So these are just normal operating expenses. So that would be like your utilities, it would be your taxes, your insurance, your groundskeeping, your building maintenance, stuff like that. Then you have CapEx or capital expenditures. Now these are my definitions, by the way. So if you look these up, they may not be exactly the same. But capital expenditures are things you're going to do to long-term improve the value of the property. The government typically defines that in dollars, and it's really low. But generally, if the expense is going to improve the value or extend the life, so replacing something that's broken probably doesn't mean that's a capital expenditure unless it's large, like a roof. You replace the roof on a property, that's going to have a 27.5 year depreciation life cycle. And so that's going to be something that is considered a capital expense. Carpet, on the other hand, is also considered a capital expense, but the lifespan on a depreciation, the depreciation lifespan on carpet is like 5 years. So it's generally capitalized, but with some of the, most of the time I just write it off as a current expense. Debt service. So that's the principal and interest portion of a mortgage that you're paying. So whenever you buy a property and you finance it, the debt service refers to just the principal and interest part of that payment. Debt service ratio. So that's basically the debt service, the amount of money you're paying toward the debt service divided by the income of the property, or the percentage of the income. So this is a percentage of gross income. Cash flow, pretty simple, money left over after paying expenses and debt service. So that's how much money, either on a monthly or annual basis, that you're going to make for that property. ROI, net profit divided by the investment cost. So what that means is a lot of times we're starting to get into some of these terms that you don't hear all the time, but return on investment, ROI, people say, hey, what's the ROI on that? And sometimes they'll be using it as a dollar amount, and sometimes they'll be using it as a percentage, but generally it's a percentage. When they use it as a dollar amount, they're basically saying it wrong, but don't tell them. And then capitalization rate. Now, this is a lot of times you hear of more in commercial properties, but cap rate is the return on investment as if it had no debt. So if you're going to buy that property for cash, that's your ROI on an annual basis. Internal rate of return is your ROI including your debt. So a lot of times when you hear internal rate of return in the stock realm, they're going to be talking about what is the company's internal rate of return, and that's referring to a requirement that the company has to make a project worthwhile. So let's say an internal rate of return would be 8% for a company, for instance. They would want to, if they're going to invest in a new piece of machinery, they have to be able to demonstrate an internal rate of return, which is their return on investment, and including how much debt service they would have to take on in order to do that, in order to make it make sense. Because they generally think that they could take that money and go someplace else and get a better return. That's how they really use for comparing projects. Net operating income. And I know this part's kind of dry, so apologize, but we're going to get through it. So net operating income is the gross income minus your operating expenses. So sometimes called NOI, or really it's just the amount of money you have left over to work with to pay the financing and to pay yourself essentially after that property is after those expenses are paid. A cash throw off is kind of another thing people say, they'll use the word cash flow. So throw off would be essentially a kind of a slang term for like, hey, how much money is this thing gonna throw off every month? It's kind of self-explanatory. And then one of my favorite things is the BRRRR method. So if you've ever heard anybody talk about the BRRRR method, they are referring to when you buy a property, you rehab that property, then you rent it. So you put a renter in there, and then you refinance the property and you repeat. And so the BRRRR method is essentially what everybody has been doing forever and ever, but then somebody came up with this acronym and it's really stuck. So if you look at any kind of research or do any kind of, if you talk to anybody about real estate that's been doing research on investments, Bigger Pockets is one of the biggest websites to go to. And that's actually started by a KW agent and a police officer. Yeah. So yeah. And it's a huge podcast. Totally recommend that website and listening to it. They get into some pretty heavy stuff nowadays.
I just started listening to his book, Brandon's book on multifamily.
Oh yeah. Which one is it? What's it called? So Brandon is he's the KW agent, right? Not the police officer?
David Green.
David Green was the KW.
Now does the podcast. So Brandon Turner started the podcast.
Brandon Turner.
He just stepped away.
I heard that. He moved to Hawaii, right?
Well, he's been living in Hawaii.
Yeah.
See the guy with red beard? Is that
Yes.
Brandon? Okay.
Beardy Brandon.
Mhm.
Beardy Brandon. That's how you remember that.
So he started that. He started there as an intern, and then basically helped the original founder create the podcast. And then now David Green, who's the KW agent,
Semi-retired, basically. Oh, okay. He is.
Yeah, he's now hosting the podcast.
Yep.
I'll tell you the name of that book in a second.
So we're gonna come back to the name. Yeah, but the BRRRR method is really what, just kind of to go a little deeper on that. So what that's referring to is you find a property you buy, that needs work, right? So you can improve the value of that property. So you have to do a capital expenditure generally to do that. So you buy the property, you invest a little bit more cash into it, and then you rehab it or finish rehabbing it, and then you rent it out. And then once you've got the tenant in there, you then refinance it because the value should have increased now since you've got a tenant in there and because the property is in better shape. So you should be able to get most of your investment out. And then you repeat that over and over. And so I can tell you specifically about one that I did here not too long ago. I bought a property in Delaware. It was a duplex. And I'm going to talk about Delaware a lot because that's where I do like 99% of my investing. We can talk about why that is later too. But so I found a duplex. It was actually in contract and fell out of contract. One side of it was the tenant was moving out and it was pretty much trashed. The other side of it, the tenant was there, but she had sort of plans to move. And the rents were around $7 something a month. I think they're around $700 a month. One was a little less. I think take that back. One was $595 and one was I think $615 or something like that. So I bought that property for $135,000. This is like 2 years ago. And I was able to get it because the people were in contract fell out because of inspections. And so it came back on the market, which is, by the way, one of the best places to find investments or any kind of deal, because now those people are discouraged and they're worried that they're not going to sell it and they probably already have plans. And so I bought it, put about 20 grand into it, about 10K on each side to just redo the kitchens, redid the bathrooms, carpet and paint. Or it's a real small plot property ranch with a single family or single car attached garage on both sides. And then rented it, right? So I found a new tenant for the side that had been vacant, and the lady who had been there had decided to move in the meantime, where it just worked out. She'd moved out, so we rehabbed that side second. And I kind of did this in the order of the empty side when I bought it, we just rehabbed that one. And then it conveniently worked out that the lady who lived on their side wanted to move as soon as I had gotten that one rented, and then we rehabbed that one. At the end of the day, that property is now rented for about $1,000 per side. So we did about an $800 a month increase in the actual monthly income. And that enabled us to, I got it right here, actually. That enabled us to refinance it. At that point was the value was 210. So we got our entire investment out of it. Today we have $0 of ours in that property, and yet it still cash flows quite a bit. So technically the return on investment is infinite. So anyway, that's about the BRRRR method. All right, so a couple of things to think about. So when you're thinking about investing in property, there are, and this is a good thing to talk about with your investor that you're talking to or for yourself. So what is your goal for the investment? Because I have seen people that have all of these goals and probably other ones. So return on investment's a pretty common one. People want to build wealth, right? They want to make some money. Cash flow. So ROI can be different. It's composed of a lot of things, but cash flow is one component of that. So however much money per month you get off of that. Appreciation obviously is the increase in the value. So if you buy Amazon stock, for instance, you're in that because you're looking for the appreciation of value, because they do not pay any dividends at all, which is what cash flow would be kind of considered would be a dividend. Some people do it for tax shelter. So if you make too much money like Teresa, you have to actually have a place to put that money so it doesn't get taken by the government and to lower your tax rate. And I do know people that do this for a hobby. Like I have one of my clients that's literally addicted to investing in real estate, and he buys stuff, fixes it up, and then sometimes rents it out, sometimes sells it, and he just can't stop. He's been trying to retire and sell stuff, and he just doesn't, he can't stop buying stuff. So that's that. So then another consideration is, what is the pain tolerance of the investor? So is their pain tolerance high? And what I mean by that, are they willing to do a lot of things themselves? Or is their pain tolerance low, where they just want to be somewhat absentee owners and let somebody else take care of everything and just cash checks every month? So those two things really feed into who the tenants are going to be. And whenever I talk with an investor about buying a property, you're never buying the property, you're buying an investment in the tenants who are going to rent the property. And the reason that's important is because you don't buy the real estate first, you buy the tenants first, because you decide that's who you think is a good investment. So some people who want maybe a higher cash flow might invest in some lower priced areas or places that are more difficult or crime heavy, and the rents are maybe lower, but the prices are vastly lower. And so they're able to buy things that cash flow a lot higher dollar amount. Other people I know buy things that are brand new, like they'll buy a brand new home that's not going to cash flow very much. In fact, it might even be a negative cash flow situation, but they do that because they have faith that that the value of the stock or the value of the home is going to be going up over time. A good example of that would be almost all of these companies that are buying the houses to rent out. So like street level or whatever it's called. And there's probably 6 or 7 companies that if you have listings, you'll have gotten offers on, but they buy houses at prices you're like, I don't understand. Like, it doesn't make sense. From when I run my numbers, it doesn't make sense. But they're banking on the appreciation of the market to take care of all that. Anything else you guys think about when you're investing? Like, what's your goal? Obviously, you wanted for retirement, you said, and diversify.
Well, I just want to go back. I think that the pain tolerance of the investor, I never thought of that. And I just talked to investors yesterday, but that's very clever.
Yeah, because if your pain tolerance is really low, you don't want to be buying in the hood because there's going to be pain associated with it, whether it's you doing something or whether you're paying somebody else to do something. I've had situations not in the hood where I've gotten a call from the police, and I think I probably told you guys this story before. I got a call from the police one night, and they said, "Hey, this lady is at this property. I want to know if she can take the washer and dryer out." And I'm like, first of all, I thought it was weird the police were calling me, but whatever. Maybe somebody was having a hard time, whatever. So I don't know. She's the girlfriend of the guy who lives there or whatever. Why don't you just ask him? And the police, well, he's in jail, so you can't ask him. And so I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'm not getting my rent this month. And so long story short, I ended up working with not the girlfriend, but the ex-wife to empty out the house because the guy was in jail and wasn't going to be paying the rent for the next 18 months, according to paying rent anywhere for the next 18 months. And so there was a lot of pain associated with that. And pretty much any landlord you talk to has those kind of stories. But pain tolerance to investors is very important. Troy, anything you want to add on that? Or
I would just say, and this, I will speak from my experience, for what maybe just from selling real estate, I always thought of the word appreciation as mostly applying to the value of the home. And the biggest thing, especially right now in our current market, inflationary market, is appreciation is also rent.
right.
I actually have an investor client of mine who does modeling for a living out of New York City. And he's like jumped on all of these like the investor calls for those companies.
Yeah.
And basically what they're basically banking on the rental appreciation. So
Rental
he said
appreciation.
they're buying these houses, and obviously the value of the asset is a reason to do it too. But more than anything, the reason why the numbers don't look good at this moment is because we're using, if it's a duplex, it could even be the current rent. But even on single families, like with inflation where it is, we have to remember that it usually takes 12 to 18 months for the rents to catch up to what's happening today because people sign 12 to 24 month
Yep.
leases. So if you had somebody in your unit 24 months ago that rented for $1,000 a month, when they move out next month, you might be able
Yeah.
to raise rent to $1,400. But
Yep.
during this moment, it's still $1,000. And I actually was listening to a podcast yesterday, which is another one I'll give you. You don't already listen to it, but he interviewed this guy whose only job it is he basically was so intrigued by real estate research 20 years ago before it was so easy to get that he built a company that just does this in every major metropolitan area. And he said one of the most interesting things, he said the government stats on wage growth are grossly underestimated. And he said the way that he knows this is, I guess there's like 5 or 6 huge property managers across the country, and they, because they're publicly traded, they have to share their information. And basically the debt or the income to rent ratio, like the average rent price has gone up, I think he said like 12 or 15% over the last year.
Yep.
But the rent to income ratio has not changed.
Really?
And so
So
he
people are
said
paying different tenants.
Government is saying that wages are only growing at like 4.75%, which is still way more than it has been. But he's saying like there's no way that that number is true because rents have gone up by 12% and our income to rent ratio has stayed exactly the same. And
Yeah.
these are like over thousands, tens of thousands of units.
You could almost probably just intuitively think about that from inflation. Inflation wouldn't happen unless the majority of people had extra money to spend.
Correct.
I mean, it just wouldn't happen. Or if there was an extreme shortage, which there kind of might be, but
But the
Yeah.
interesting thing though, because there's some people, and this is going deep into economics, but I feel like you went there a little bit.
I tried to
There's
go.
some people that have hypothesized that the reason why people have that money is because of the stimulus that's happened COVID,
Probably.
and that it wasn't going to be consistent money.
But was that part of their income though?
No, that's the thing. When they're writing down their income, they're saying this is what I make from my job.
Right.
And so if that has gone up by 12 to 15%,
Yep.
then that 4.5% number that the government is using just for whatever reason just isn't accurate.
They're looking at just certain jobs probably and not accurate, but
to
it's interesting.
On what I started saying with appreciation, just the rent, I think
Yeah.
rent appreciation is something real, and especially in this market, you have a lot of investors that are buying lower cap rates.
Yeah.
Because they feel confident that with inflation and wage growth, that there's no way that in 2 or 3 years, because even if there's a downturn in the real estate market,
Yep.
the only thing, or a slowdown, let's say, the only thing that that's going to do is create more renters.
Yeah, I was going to say the one thing I didn't put up here is inflation hedge. Like I kind of have that as part of inflation or appreciation, but like, yeah, I mean, if you look at these big corporations and these retirement funds, a lot of the retirement funds are with who's funneling or fueling these other companies that are buying all the real estate. And the reason that they are doing that is because the bond market sucks. Like you can't get any return on your investment from the bond market, but real estate is appreciating, right? So it's going up as fast, if not faster than the stock than inflation is. And it's a real asset. So there's no chance or very little chance that it's going to fall completely to zero. In fact, with the land, you'll never really see it go to zero unless, well, if we get nuclear war going on, that could happen, I guess. But that's about it. We have bigger problems. Yeah. Well, it's not, it's probable. It's possible. It's not probable. So lots of things to talk about, especially with investors you're talking about. Make sure you clearly understand what their goal is, because a lot of people will listen to these podcasts and will watch late night infomercials like I did. And that's how I got into real estate investing, or read Rich Dad, Poor Dad and really jump into it without understanding what they're doing. And if they tell you that their goal is to get rich overnight, they're probably going to be not happy unless you help coach them through that, because real estate generally is not a get rich quick scheme. It's a get rich long-term scheme. All right. So did I miss something? All right. So we're going to go back into, I think I messed up. Let me back up. No, that's it. So we're going to go into an example. So this is what I think most people wanted to see was, how do you actually evaluate a single family house? And this one I'm going to use with one I closed on Friday. So I just bought this house. Like literally, these are the numbers that we looked at. The only other thing I'll tell you is that I'm buying this as part of a 1031 exchange. And so our down payment is a whole lot bigger than what it said. And we had a whole lot more motivation to do it because we're coming to the end of our exchange period. So at the end of the time, you might say, why the hell did he buy this property? But I'll show you. Yeah, full disclosure. So this is a 3-bedroom, tax payment was going to be a lot bigger than the payment payment. 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath, 1,488 square foot, 2-story with a 2-car garage located in Delaware. So I have a property management company in Delaware, which is this down here, and we manage about 50 or so properties. Phil Hennessy is actually on here somewhere, I think. He's our property management operations manager, or property manager. I'm not sure. He's not quite licensed yet, so we can't say property manager, I think, but he'll be licensed here shortly. And I'm sure he feels the pressure I'm putting on him. But anyway, we bought it for $237,500. We're forecasting the rental amount to be $1,850 a month. One of the questions I get sometimes is, where do you find rental amounts? It's exactly the same thing you do with pricing a property, except it's harder to find. Generally, I will consult Zillow because they have a rentals estimate, and they also have a lot of these big companies on there that will actually be looking for rentals. So I look there. I look on Facebook Marketplace to find out what other homes are renting for, and there's a bunch of different groups that have rental advertising them. So Facebook Marketplace groups, I think is what those, or Facebook groups. That's two things really. You can look at Craigslist if you want, but I don't know that anybody puts anything on Craigslist anymore. And there are lots of other websites like HotPads and Rent Links. I think a Rent Links may be the backbone of it, but in any case, Rentometer or Rentometer. Yep. That's a pay service, right? Or you can get a couple for free. Is it right? Accurate, you think?
Well, the thing is, if you pay for the pro, then they'll give you all the details about the property. So usually you can go Google, I always find like the 4 best comps.
Yep.
Using Rentometer, so I don't have to go to
Okay.
17 different
And how much does that cost a month or a year?
I it's maybe $200 a year.
It's not very much, I know,
You
yeah.
get 500.
200 a year.
500 polls, and the amount of time that it saves me from having to go to 7 different websites.
Right.
And
We should
I
probably
was-
just partner up on that.
Yeah,
and
well,
and I
yeah,
pay you $100.
I used 100
Right.
this year, so
Exactly.
anyways. Hey, I would love to ask you, and maybe you'll get to this, so
Yep.
you can stop me. But is there a reason, like the 1488 square feet, is that just driven by price? Or do you find, because my
So-
experience has been that as long as you have the 3 bedrooms and the 2 full baths, that the overall square footage actually doesn't matter on rentals. And
Probably
the
true.
cost to replace carpet, paint, do all those things is significantly less on a 1,500 square foot house than it is on an 1,800 or 1,900 square foot house. Does that ever factor in or not really?
In this situation, I probably didn't because this was more of an opportunity. But yeah, I mean, for sure, I actually like to rent in them. So if you think about all the houses you could rent, you've got apartments, you've got townhouses or duplexes, and you've got small houses, medium-sized houses, and large houses. I kind of like to play in the medium to smallish house area or duplexes. This one is probably mid-size for the area that it's in. So I don't like to have 10 tons of people in my houses, like because there's a lot more wear and tear. So 3 bedrooms generally precludes people with lots of extra people. And so the rule we go by is 2 heartbeats per bedroom. So the most people you could have in this house is 6. You can't have any more than that. If you have more than that, that's against our policy. And that's the one I've always heard to use. Taxes are 47.84 a year, and insurance is it's about 900 a year. If I threw 1,000 in there, make it make sense. So some of the assumptions also for this one. So the tenant is going to pay all the utilities, including the water and everything else. Tenant's going to take care of the grass and landscaping. Although one of the things I do with all of my rentals is I actually pay for the chemical service, like the True Green. I have True Green commercial account. And we have them treat like, I don't know, 20 properties or something like that. And the reason I do that is because grass is one of those things that if you decide to sell the property, it takes a while to get back to good looking good. So I've had tenants do things where they totally burn out the grass by putting too much chemicals on it or not treat it at all. And then if you aren't driving by it, you don't even know that. Management company will be managing it at a 10% fee, which is my management company. So that works out great. And vacancy, I typically figure 1 month every other year per unit. And the reason on houses, the reason I figure that is because it's probably low. I mean, it's probably a conservative estimate. Most people in a house are going to stay for more than 1 year, at least 2 years, most likely, and probably longer than that. And then we're putting, this assumption, we're figuring a down payment 25% and 30-year fixed at 4.875, which is what we got literally closed out yesterday, which I know is not a phenomenal rate, but that is because it is our like 18th single family house. And so we don't get the opportunity to have the best rates, because when you get above 10, you start having problems.
Clarifying question for the folks at home.
Yep.
Management company will be managing at 10%.
10% of gross rents. Is that what you mean?
Yep.
So 10% is typical for depending on the number of units you have that you're asking for somebody to manage, 10% is a pretty normal, like if you look at bigger pockets, that's the number they typically use. That's what we charge if you have 1 unit. If you have multiple units, we would be lower.
So in this case, you're like charging like about 200.
Actually, we'll go into the numbers.
That'd be cool.
So the dreaded math, which is what we are going into next. So when this all works out, the first thing you want to think about is payment, right? So the principal and interest part is $938.68, and then PITI is $1,420.68, and our gross income $22,200 per year. That my income will go up next year, but that payment will stay the same. That's another big advantage of real estate. Your debt service, unless it goes down, because I would definitely refinance it to go down, but likely that's one of the best things about lending on this property is that if you're in that 10 range, you can get fixed rate loans. And with my dad and I owning this company together, that's how we have 18, is that I have 10, he's got 8 now. So we only have 2 more left before we're topped out and I have to go to a commercial style loan. That's some of the math there. Those are pretty simple math. So now we're getting into some of the other. Yeah, for sure. Go back. Yep.
Is if you do happen to be married and your spouse works or makes money, it is per person.
Good tip.
So you can actually own, like as a couple, 20, but have to make sure that you start buying them in individual names. So like you can't both, if you both go on one loan, it counts for one for each of you.
Yep.
So basically.
You can both be
start-
on title, but you both
you
can't
can
be on the
both
loan.
On title, but you want only one person on the loan. and so
Yep.
You can't qualify anymore.
Best investment, real, actually any kind of investment advice I'd ever gotten. And I know that my wife is not going to watch this, so it's okay for me to say this. You can marry more money in 30 minutes than you can ever make in a lifetime. So just remember that. But that's not really investment advice. Anyway,
It is in a way.
it is. You can invest in your, hopefully you like the person, but if you don't like them, hopefully they're old. Operating expenses on this particular house, 4784 for taxes, 1,000 for insurance. Maintenance, I just figured at 25 bucks a month because this house is pretty much ready to go. I mean, on single families, a lot of times you don't have hardly any maintenance unless you have a big problem. You need to plan for capital expenditures, but you don't necessarily take that into account when you're doing this unless it's something that's imminent. If you know you need to replace the furnace, you want to amortize that cost over 12 months because you know you're going to be getting it, you can bake that in. But anyway, I just use 25 bucks a month for that. And then management, 2220 per year. And then utilities, the tenant's paying for them. So I'm going to figure zero. So that makes our annual operating expenses 8304. So the next number you need to know when you're getting ready to calculate some of these things like cap rate and all that kind of stuff is your effective annual gross income. And all that is your gross income minus your vacancy. So you just take and subtract your 0.40416, whatever it is, from your income. And that was the 923. So I get you to 21,276. As we then go into the next calculation, you look at your annual net operating income. This is the part that if you guys want me to spend more time on, I can, but I'm gonna try and blow through it because I'm sure it's riveting. So your effective annual gross income minus your operating expenses. So essentially this net operating income or NOI is what is one of the big numbers you hear that talk about on commercial type stuff. And it's essentially what money do you have to pay for debt service and what money do you have to pay for your profit? Because that's what comes out after that. The difference between net operating income and from your cash flow is that operating income is going to include your taxes and insurance. Or net operating income will, but your cash flow will include that plus your principal and your interest. That makes sense? I think I said that right. And then this is the one that everybody talks about, cap rate. So whenever you hear, somebody say, hey, what's your cap on that or whatever, they're talking about the cap rate of the property. And so in this case, the cap rate is the net, in every case, is the net operating income annually divided by the purchase price. And so what that means is if we paid cash for this property, we'd be getting a 5.49% ROI, which is not too phenomenal, but that's pretty close to what the market is right now in terms of, and people are actually buying 4 caps and even less because these are based on, to Troy's point, today's dollars and today's rent. And so that's probably the worst that this property is going to get unless there's major repairs or something like that come in or mismanagement, which we won't do.
It might be a little better than what you forecasted because I think you've got the wrong purchase price.
Oh, you're right. I do. Yeah. It's a little bit better, actually. Tiny bit. I thought 237.5. You're right. Anyway, it's pretty close to that. Gross rent multiplier is kind of a quick,
Go back to that one more time.
sure can.
Just for the folks at home,
Folks at home.
the cap rate percentage is there a cap rate percentage that you think people should aim for?
Cap rate percentage is really kind of a personal, not saying it's not personal. It's when you come to commercial real estate, they talk a lot about what the cap rates are in a certain area, and you can actually get what cap rates they're getting on investments by looking at the different, what's the name of the software you guys know Troy uses? It's more of a commercial term. They publish cap rates like average cap rates, but they're usually in arrears, so they're not going to help you that much.
But would you say that 5.49%, is that like a
Is that good
number?
or bad, you mean?
Yeah, like, is that one of the numbers that you look at to decide, is this gonna be worth it?
Personally, I pretty much look at cash flow and I look at what I feel like is appreciation possibilities. So I think that's good. It's pretty decently average right now. 6 cap is about what people typically look at. But this is all going to be leveraged. So that's not my real rate of return. So that's where this gets a little bit crazy. So this is where we'll jump into that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to remember with cap rate is it's really just a way to look at your investment compared to the market.
Yep.
By taking the loan out of it.
or by looking at this investment compared to any other investment
Right.
you might be considering.
Because everybody puts down different amounts, and so it's just a way to look at
It's
like,
equalizer.
how it compares to the market. But ultimately, I think especially if you're in the like this example, the residential space, the cap rate is not really a super important number. When you get into large multifamily, that's considered commercial.
Yep.
And literally investors buy off of that number.
Yeah, the
So-
fact that an investor who's new might even call you as a real estate agent, say, hey, I'm looking to get a 7 cap. What can you get me? And the first question I always ask is this the first investment you've made or the,
Yeah.
oh, you know, because if you're saying you just want a 7 cap, I can get you a 7 cap, but you're not going to like what it feels like because we're going to be down in a hilltop or we're going to be in some area you may not think is real fun to be in. And generally the worst area, the better the cap rate, because it's strictly based on cash flow and expenses and not on future appreciation rates.
But the other thing I think it's important whenever you talk about cap rate, like Ryan said, those were his definitions. Like everybody's definitions of how you're going to get to the net operating income can be different. I mean, I think there is a published, like if you look in the dictionary way, but some people would include CapEx expenses in their formula. Some people, and so
Yep.
it's always important. I think the best way to show that you know what you're talking about is to say, okay, tell me how you got to your net operating expenses.
Right. Yeah. You don't want to assume you know what they're baking in.
Yeah.
So if you ask them to tell you that, then you're going to get the real number because
Yep.
that cap rate could change a lot.
Yeah. It's interesting how that works too, because and we'll go into this too, but the cap rate for a multifamily is going to be different than the operating expenses for a multifamily are vastly different than the operating expenses for a single family. Single family is by far the simplest, and that's why I picked that one to go through in this thing. Couple other things you might hear: gross rent multiplier, which is really just the purchase price divided by the something got cut off there by the gross income. And so a lot of times, oh yeah, it says income over here. Sorry. This one came in at 10.65 for single families. I find that's pretty close, somewhere pretty similar, 10 to 11. But sometimes you get down below that, but it's hard to get much above that because the rental amount is generally determined by the type of property. Monthly cash flow is just your net operating income minus your principal and interest. So this one only came in at $142 once I paid myself the 10% for the management. And then the cash on cash ROI or cash on cash return, sometimes they call it, is just 2.89%. So if you're just looking at cash, and this is probably not a great investment from what you're thinking about. So, but my internal rate of return, which would be, well, that's not what we're going to go to, but we're going to talk about total rate of return. So when we talk about total rate of return, we're talking about cash flow, appreciation, equity buildup, and then depreciation, loss, tax savings. And so if you add all those things up, this one actually ends up for me at a 50 after 2 years, because I bought this at a discount, because it's conditioned and the amount of money I have to put into it is fairly minimal to get to a renting standpoint. Within 2 years, the amount of money I put down, I'm going to get to about a 56% return on investment for each year for those 2 years, which sounds ridiculously high, I know, but that's the number is what it is. And that's really where the power comes in of real estate, I feel like, because you're an agent. So the way I bought this one was a client of mine who's actually a friend of ours. They wanted to build a house, so I helped them build a house, and we got paid a commission on that. And then I bought their house this was actually afterwards. I've done this a couple of different ways. They were getting ready to put their house on the market. He's in the house painting, and he's belly aching about how much work it is to paint. And I'm like, would you be interested if I just threw you an offer to buy it as it is with no commissions or anything involved? And he said, of course, he'd be interested in that. Oops. So I threw him an offer at the 236.5. This house is probably today on the market worth 260, 265. But I think what I did is it might be worth more, because last I heard things were going way above list price. But when you base it on the comparables, if it was to sell at 265 and you back out the commissions, and then I gave him, and then I backed out some money for the work that needed done. That was the offer I came up with for him. And he said, I'll take it. He could have freely said no, and I could have put it on the market and we could have got him basically the same amount of money net, or maybe more. I told him that, and I made him sign something that said, you understand that I'm going to be potentially making money off of this and that kind of thing, and that it's worth more on the market. But they still didn't want to mess with it. They wanted the convenience. So that's how the 56.89 came about. So Any questions on any of that?
And that number is based off of the amount of money that you have in it.
It's based on the amount of my money. So that's because of the leverage. So the 2.89% ROI is based on the cash, but the 56.89% is based on my overall return, because it also takes into account depreciation losses. And it's also, I figured a 4% appreciation rate for the next 2 years. So that appreciation is probably way low, the one I factored in. Equity buildup is just how much more money the mortgage is being paid down. And then we talked about the depreciation tax loss, but I assumed a 28% tax bracket, just because I don't know what everybody's brackets are.
And then anybody who manages it themselves would also save that.
Yeah, that's including me paying the 10%.
Yeah, $185 a month.
So I always look at stuff and I say, if I can't make 30% ROI, I'm not going to buy it for the most part. That's kind of like when I get to my total return on investment. And I can say that almost everyone, pretty much every one of my investments is making more than that. And I can tell you that my stock guy is super happy when he makes me 9 to 10% a year on consistently. And that's when he said, so it shows me, I remember the first time I sat down with my financial planner, who's a great guy, but it's totally different apples and oranges. He's like, we were looking at my first year review returns and it was like 9 point something. This is several years ago. And I'm like, that's great. Is that it? You know, it was kind of my thought, because I knew I was getting 30% plus on everything I'm doing in real estate. So pretty much since that time, I haven't invested much money in stocks. So we don't have a ton of time left, so I want to jump on a couple other examples. So example 2, 4-unit apartment building. So this building is a 4 units. They're 2-bedroom apartments. Purchase price $375. Rental amount per apartment is about $900. Annual taxes, I figured this up based on the valuation in Delaware County, $89.75, and then insurance of around $1,800 a year. So these assumptions may be a little bit looser than some of the other ones. I do not own a 4-unit building right now, so I'll kind of say that, but I own several duplexes. And these probably are not, these are probably fairly aggressive for the duplexes. Now here's the assumptions that are different. So in a 4-unit building, you're probably paying for more than you're paying for in a single family. The tenant's probably going to pay their electricity, but a lot of times the owner will pay for the heat and the water and the sewer and trash, depending on what it is. So if you're going to make an investment in something bigger than a single family, you have to make sure you understand all the expenses you're going to be responsible for. The owner's probably taking care of the grass unless you can pick one of the tenants to do it, but technically you're then still doing the grass. Management companies will maybe charge you a little bit less based on the number of units you have. Vacancy, I pretty well kept consistent there. It'd be 1 month every other year, 4.16%. And then again, 25% down, 30-year fixed. Your rate on a multifamily house up to 4 units is going to be fixed if you're under 10 mortgages or 10 mortgage properties. However, your rate will be higher because it's a multifamily property by about a quarter or so, something like that. That's probably a pretty conservative or pretty aggressive number, actually, in terms of the percentage you can get. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to the spreadsheet, because I like spreadsheets and they save my life a lot. So we're not doing that math longhand anymore. So I have a spreadsheet that I just pop all this stuff into, and I've got some fancy things in here that I can do some things with. But the assumptions I made were that the gas is going to be $150 a month. Water is going to be about $40 a unit. And that's what our utility costs are going to be. Operating costs from maintenance is $162.50, which is $25 per unit. Our management is 8%. And there's the rest of the assumptions up there. Oops. And this is the numbers. So the real estate spreadsheet actually pulls these all out for you. So annual operating expenses of about $19,000 with an effective annual gross income of $41,000. And then this gets you to a cap of 5.73. But notice your rent multiplier is much lower. So it's a better, more favorable situation. The lower the rent multiplier, the better. So we're 8.68. And now your cash required to purchase this is a whole lot higher than the last one, but your cash flow is also about double, and your annual cash flow is higher, which then makes your tax or total return on investment quite a bit higher. Now in this property, I made the assumption that you didn't do anything. You just bought it as is. Not as is. I mean, you're buying without having to do any improvements to it, or you're not going to gain any money by changing any of the circumstances. And so this is a little bit more like, hey, I'm just going to buy it and operate it, not going to buy it and make any changes. So that's what I think that's a fairly typical. Do you have any 4 units, either of you guys? You know, a 4-unit? Yours is a single family Airbnb? Yeah, yeah, there's not that many 4 units in Columbus.
No, there's not.
I had a bunch there. know Patrick, well, I thought about that too. Patrick Florence has a couple of 4 units, I think that he, yeah, he was smart. Yeah, smarter than everybody else I know. Any questions on any of that? So, and by contrast, again, we're going to flip to a now much bigger example, 20 unit complex. So a couple of things that are different here. Your purchase price is quite a bit higher. This is an actual one that just sold in Delaware not too long ago. And I use Delaware just because I'm more familiar with the numbers. 1.4 million, rental income of around $900 for a 2-bedroom and $750 for a 1-bedroom. Annual tax is about $9,000, which is probably low. I wonder if I forgot to update that on here. I know I updated on the spreadsheet. And insurance is going to be a significantly higher, about $8,000 a year, something like that, for 20 units. I have a 10-unit building, but I don't have a 20. So in this scenario now, and this is going to be specific to building, but this tenant's going to pay for all of their own utilities. The only thing the owner is paying for is trash. Owner is still going to take care of landscaping and all the grass. Now, your management fees are going to be lower percentage-wise because you have multiple units. Vacancy, probably going to be about the same if you have a good management company, although sometimes if you are, that's one of the numbers that can bite you if you're not careful. And that's actually what you would hire a property manager to do, is to fix that problem for you, is to get rid of your vacancy, because a lot of single owners I've found aren't that concerned about quick turns, or they're concerned about it, but they don't do enough. They don't do anything about it. So they may not start to do anything until their tenant moves out. Whereas like a good property management company should be inspecting like 30, 45 days ahead of time once that notice is turned in, to figure out what's going to need done and have contractors lined up, ready to jump on it as soon as it's vacant. So you can get your turn time down from, and also start marketing it, so you can have your turn time be 2 weeks instead of be a month and a half. That's the value of a good property manager. One of the values. And then back to the spreadsheet. So popping these numbers in here. So I used, yeah, so property taxes are 34,000, not 8,000. I knew it was different. Insurance about 12 grand a year. So I think I had forgotten to update a couple of those numbers. Your management's only going to cost you $1,100 a month, essentially. And then that's going to be $198,000 income. So when you look at the bottom line numbers on this one, this is where things start to become pretty good. So a lot of times when we hear from investors to have a lot of money, they don't want to buy a single or a double. They want to buy 20 or 40 unit. I've heard 40 units is really where you start making money at. Not that $53,000 a year isn't money, but, and again, on this one, I only assumed a 4% return on your investment, or a return on your appreciation. So a couple of things I guess I would notice about this. One is the higher the purchase price, the more money you make every year from appreciation, right? So if you buy a $500,000 building, you're making 4% of 500. If you buy a $200,000 building, you're making 4% of 200, which those two numbers are not the same. Equity build is much higher. The other thing about 20 units now, you're in a commercial loan. So I don't know if I talked about that, but it was on that previous sheet, I think a couple of sheets back. So, I mean, or maybe it wasn't there. So a 30-year amortization potentially, and a lot of times they'll only do 20 or 25-year amortizations, but the variable rate interest is a big deal. Most of the time, if you're buying a small building, a small complex, you're probably working, when I say small, I mean less than 40 or 50, you're working with a local bank, and that local bank is going to be having different requirements for interest. Like the bank I work with is Richwood Bank up in Delaware, or they're out of Richwood technically. They have a Marysville branch, but I think our rates with them are around 5.25 or something like that, maybe, if we were to get a loan to them, but it's variable. So it's on a 1-year arm, I think, is basically what that comes down to. I know Union Savings Bank, I have another loan with them. I had a 5-year arm with that one, with a commercial loan, because I bought a 10-unit building with that. And it's fixed for the first 5 years, but then after year five, it adjusts annually. So the financing is a big difference for bigger multifamily. The expectations also, let me go back to that, sorry. The expectations of what you do, I mean, they're expecting somebody probably in a multifamily to have, there'll be a lot more maintenance costs, I think, because you'll have somebody you have to pay either on staff, or potentially just because you have more units, you have more costs. You may have turn costs a little bit higher. I guess this doesn't really say that. I'd plan on talking about some of those things, I guess. But you know, the bigger that's kind of my next sort of thing. So I didn't really talk about this much in the beginning, but so my dad and I have a company, and we own about 26 or 27 units together. One of them's a 10-unit building. We have a bunch of duplexes and a bunch of single family houses. And then we manage through our property management division another 25 or so, or 27 units. Haven't counted it. So we're at about 54, I think, is what Phil told me last I checked. I don't think he's on here still. I just can't see it. But in any case, I would really like to invest in a large multifamily. If somebody knows of anybody selling one, I'd be happy to hear about that. Because I feel like that's where I think we have our property management company is the right size where we could then basically have on-site management and then hire an on-site person. From a property management standpoint, just to kind of give you a little bit, if you're interested in doing that, I found there's very low margins, like extremely low margins. So it's not surprising that people don't do it very often. And the scale you need to be at is about, so I think 50 units is the minimum I would do. 100 units is where you can start to make a little bit of money from a management standpoint, but even then you're subject to pretty big swings if you have large vacancy, for instance, or have something like COVID happen and then the government says you don't have to pay a rent. That's a big deal, and they just expect the landlords to suck it up. So, and we're getting close to the end. So bottom line, real estate investing is not for everyone, but it can be a powerful tool to build wealth. I think if you're a real estate agent and you're not investing in real estate, you're completely leaving you're just taking yourself for granted by not doing that, leaving a huge opportunity off the table. And there isn't any other investment other than a business that I know that you can leverage, that you can get depreciation and tax write-offs from, and that is a hedge against inflation. So I like it even better than my sales business, to be honest with you. It's much more stable. So questions, commentary, anything? Go ahead.
At the beginning of the talk, you said you invest a lot in Delaware and you would tell us why later. Is that mostly because you live there or is
yes.
there another advantage?
So I live in Ostrander, and I once heard a smart guy tell me, don't invest in anything that's farther than 20 minutes from your house, and I'm taking care of it myself. I've found that because I bought a couple investments. I had one in Dublin for a while, and it was much harder to take care of. I got a 10-unit building in Marysville, and the rest of my stuff is in Delaware. I did for a while until last year have a bunch of things up in Portage County, which is about 2 hours away, where my dad and mom, where I grew up at. And so my dad managed those, but then he started going to Florida for the winter. And the problem became that I was the manager then all winter long, and it was really hard to manage a property long term or long distance, especially when we only had 10 of them up there. If we had 20 or 30, I could have probably hired somebody else, but I only had 10. So, and that was a fair amount, but that's the reason I like Delaware also, because I think the money at least used to be on the fringes, and Delaware was the fringe, but it's not really the fringe anymore. It's kind of moved up north. So if I was looking to invest today and I had no other real estate, and I lived somewhere like in the Delaware County area, I might be looking at Johnstown real freaking hard because of Intel. I might be looking at Sunbury. I'd be looking at, I don't like rural properties too much personally because I don't like to deal with the septic system. I live in one that has that, but I don't want to deal with it at rental properties. And maybe vacant land. The other thing I would go back to saying too is that we really just talked about rental property. We didn't talk at all about other real estate investments, which could be, if you have a really low pain tolerance, but you have a lot of money, a triple net land lease would be an amazing sort of investment for you. If you could get by a triple net lease being something we didn't talk at all about, but a lease where you're basically just, you own the land, somebody comes in like a McDonald's or actually McDonald's would not be one. Somebody like a car auto shop comes in, like a Pet Boys, or we don't have Pet Boys here, do we? Whatever we have. With a business comes in, they build a building on that land, and then they're responsible for paying the operation expenses, all the building expenses, and the taxes on the property and the insurance. Actually, really, so it's operating expenses, taxes, insurance that you're net of, and they pay you a flat amount every month, and you just keep cash and checks. Cell phone towers would be a great example of that. A land where a cell phone tower would be. That's probably the lowest, but the returns are probably a little bit lower too, but you got to have a lot of money to do that. And then also you're very much fixed into what they've built. So I went off topic there. Sorry.
Anybody else have a question?
Yeah.
I have a question. Very broad question. How do you find investors?
Easy. Pick up the phone. How do you find investor clients? Well, how would you find an investor client if you were looking for one?
All absentee owners, that would be with financial advisors one day, that would put all my friends in the state of college, went to law school.
Sounds like you know what to do. So what's keeping you from doing it? No, I mean, seriously, that's,
Seems like a lot. That would
yeah, so investors are generally, the people I have as investors, as I think about them, they're not anybody in specifically. A lot of the ones I have are actually people who didn't intend to become investors, but became investors unintentionally when the market took a tanking, went down. Because they had a house that they moved out of and they needed somebody to rent it out. That's one source of them. Nowadays, most people can sell a house if they want to. If you're looking for someone to hire to invest in property and you help them to buy a house, is what you're talking about. Yeah, I would just,
I think the best way to do that is to buy an investment yourself.
that could be, yeah.
I noticed that as soon as I own, because I got my license in '04 and I didn't buy my first investment until 13. And as soon as I could tell stories about when I bought the last property I bought with my properties, like people immediately look at you as
Yep.
a local economist, basically on that topic. I mean, I was at brunch the other day in Pittsburgh at my son's hockey tournament, and the guy next to me is just like, yeah, I've been thinking about buying blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, really? What about? And you start asking those questions that you did, and now he's going to buy an investment property. Like, I think just and if you can't do that right now, then you need to spend as much time as possible working with people that are.
And I would also start to educate yourself on these terms, like learn and be comfortable with these kind of things, because investors throw them around occasionally. You can tell when somebody's throwing the term around who just learned it and somebody who really understands it. So I would start with like going to Bigger Pockets and looking at the glossary. I thought it was the wrong one.
Multifamily Millionaire. is the name of that book.
Multifamily millionaire, yeah.
And they basically wrote 2 editions. The first one is small multifamily, which I would definitely recommend starting with. And then the
Yeah.
second one is larger, but they basically go through each one of these terms in a lot more detail and explain why they're important. I mean, honestly, it's one of the best investment books I've ever listened to.
I'm gonna have to listen to that.
Yeah, it's
but-
really good.
Bigger Pockets is a great place. You should definitely read Rich Dad Poor Dad. If you've not read Rich Dad Poor Dad, it's like the Bible of getting into real estate investing. And then I would say the other thing is just like you say, buy one. And I had another thing. Oh, Hold is a great book to read.
Really good.
If you've never read that book, it's and we have access to the authors. Like you could probably set up a call with Linda and Jimmy real easily if you just talk to Dana. I'm sure she could set that up. You could probably just email them. I would get us too. But so Linda and Jimmy McKissick, do you guys know who those people are? Yeah, they're the owners of the region, and Jimmy's one of my heroes. Not to say Linda's not either, but she is. But them as a couple are amazing. Something else I was going to mention, I forget what it was. I guess the big takeaways I would say is that the biggest thing I want people to understand is that the tenants determine the real estate. The real estate does determine the tenants, but whenever you're working with an investor, you want to ask the question, who do you want to rent to? Because that's the most important thing to answer. I feel like the Airbnb thing, your target is basically people who are traveling and here for a short period of time. I like to rent to small families because I like to provide housing that is, affordable and quality. That's part of I want people to have a great place to live and to, I get some sort of feel good out of that, even though I make money out of it too. But, determine the tenants, number one. So if somebody comes to you and wants to invest, and actually your question was more, how do you find the investors? I think the other thing is to talk to people who have money, like talk to your parents' friends. Say, hey, have you ever been afraid of losing your money in the stock market? Or put on Facebook and say, does anybody know anyone who'd like to buy an investment property? I bet you get 50 responses to something like that, because when you ask that question, it kind of struck me weird because I know we have so many investor people that our buyers agents don't even want to take any more on because it's difficult to find investments today, and people's expectations are really high. I get calls probably at least I don't know how many times a week you guys get calls, but probably at least 2 to 3 times a month from people out of state who want to invest in Columbus. Specifically, have gotten calls because of the Intel thing, and also just because it's an affordable place to live. So I think if you just do what you said, talk to your friends and parents of friends, I don't know how old you are, but generally parents have more money. If they're still around, but that's what I would do. Anything else you'd tell Sam?
I mean, I think going to the local meetups and stuff, which kind of.
The
went
RIA.
on hold for a little bit, but now RIA, all those places are back. Go to, I mean, Ashley went, did a walkthrough on a wholesale deal the other day, and there was like 50 cars up and down the street. Go to one of those wholesale deals where there's a million investors and just
Yeah.
those guys. I think it's ultimately a numbers game, just like everybody else, but making sure, I mean, somebody that says they're an investor versus somebody who's actually gonna buy something, like to Ryan's point, I think that's probably the biggest danger with just going out looking for investors, is just that they're not all created equal, just like buyers. Like,
The best investor I find would be somebody who's already owned one or two properties because they know what they're doing. And they're not going to be emotional about what they're buying at all. The only bad thing is they can run you around and they tend not to be loyal. I've found that too, because they want a deal or they want something. So if you've got the deal and bring it to them, then Ash, the same.
Investors, sort of, they're difficult to work with, because I just had one on Friday, went to a good office exclusive that Sarah office here, and he's pretty well honest with me. He said, look, I would only offer 175 for this home, but he knows, he said, I know in this market they'll get 200 plus figure. Mine is 175. They're almost that deal. Big thing then is if you can find them that one before it goes to the market, that's when they really can.
Yeah.
They're all off markets. On the other hand, how to pick up an investor, I've actually picked it up. $5,000 open house. 10 investors walking up, 1,000 deal.
Yep.
And, yeah, I've got them in my database. I don't waste a lot of time on them, but I feed a lot of stuff to them.
Yeah. Set them up on a search and let them call you.
Pick up, I'll pick up the phone to you, especially if you've got the off market ones. I had a lady that sold a home for $1 million in Wexford. She wouldn't let anyone walk through that home without her being present, even though it was empty. I've now done 2 deals with her just by showing her home. There was an investment property in Wexford, and I found one of them on the market. So they're hard to work with, and I don't spend a lot of time on them. I just feed them. But the beautiful thing about feeding them, you're top of mind to them a lot of the time. You may not be, but at least showing that you're working 100% of the time. They appreciate things more than 100%. Yes, they do try and fudge you around on commission like that. You'll learn your trade even more. So you don't invest, you know what to invest with your money.
Yeah. And you have to teach them to value you, is what it comes down to. And they're asking you about commissions, they're probably questioning your value. And you just haven't done a good enough job of explaining it yet. So if you bring them an off-market deal, there's a lot of value there because they don't have to compete. So
The other thing is the big difference between investor and home buyer is emotion.
no emotion.
And
Generally.
investor is absolutely zero emotion. They don't
Yeah.
care. If the numbers don't add up, then they move on, and that's it.
Yep.
And that is, for me, your age group, I come on my kid's friend who invests. And the only reason I've been able to work with them is because I find it very fun. I love it. And I think they feel that enthusiasm. So you, to these guys' point, you just get used to the vocabulary, using that language, and you're like, oh.
Yeah. You just got to become a student of the business.
But I think
Yeah.
too, the other thing, like finding a spreadsheet, or maybe Ryan would be willing to share it or
Sure.
whatever, but in this market, for me, like I have a couple investors that buy a lot of stuff, but every time they send me something, I'm running numbers trying to figure out why I don't need to waste my time and go show it to them.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot of stuff, like, do not just go out and show an investor, because they'll go look at houses all day long.
Yeah.
And then you find out.
Because it's fun for them.
Oh, well, the only way they were gonna buy it was for 175. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, dude, no, hey, how many offers do you have? Oh, 10? Would it be fair to say that they would all be over the 200 list price? Yes. Okay, hey, we're not
Yep.
going to So the more you can do that, I mean, yes, it's still a pain sometimes, but it takes a lot less time to throw 7 numbers into a spreadsheet than it does to go set up a showing, go to the
Yeah.
showing, stand out in the driveway and talk to them for the 17th time about cap rate, because they're excited. They don't get to do real estate every day.
Yeah, the biggest thing I did when I first started investing in real estate was I like became a sponge, and I like, this is gonna sound really old school, but I went to the library and checked out books, and I read all the books. Like I remember one time I was sitting in my bed, I had like 20 books, and I had the maximum. Yeah.
No, under the
Ran out of
cover.
I had my nightcap on, and it was my gown. I was before I was even married, actually. That's probably how I, but anyway, yeah, it was just, so now I would be like listening to podcasts all the time. The other thing I did that was probably super valuable was I had a job that sucked at the time. And so I would run, I had this spreadsheet that I've used for years and years and years. I would run numbers on every house that came up. Like, and that was back when there was a lot of houses to run them on, but just even randomly, just pick a house, run it through the numbers and figure out what it looks like. And that way you'll understand, like, okay, so a 10 gross rent multiplier is okay if it's a single family, but if it's a multi, you're probably needing something lower than that.
And multifamilies out, if you're gonna practice, are good ones because usually they already have.
More
notes in
complex. Yeah.
there. And so at least you don't have to go out and like,
Yep.
find every number. A lot of times the net operating income, even though it's usually wrong.
Yeah, it's wrong.
something will be listed in that.
Yeah. It's because the agent doesn't understand what the word means most of the time, but all right, well, we're going to turn this off here, but thanks guys for
Yeah,
coming.
thanks, Ryan.
And hopefully you guys learned something. Yes.